On a sweltering day in late July, a military training exercise, simulating combat conditions in Iraq. The mission to enter a potentially hostile village and make contact with the local police chief.
And make sure they're not pointing their weapons at the mosque.
Georgian soldiers training closely with American Marines. Their tiny nation, one of the very few members of the Coalition of the Willing, left helping America in Iraq. Georgia's 4th Infantry was to deploy to Iraq in November. At a time when other coalition members were drawing down, Georgia was actually increasing its commitment.
Third! Hammer to the left!
So alongside the Marines, these Georgian troops trained for potential battle. And in a makeshift command center a few miles away, their leaders consulted with American officers on command and control. What no one knew was that only 10 days later, the men of the Georgian 4th Brigade, some of these very same soldiers, would indeed be engaging the enemy. Not in Iraq, but on their own soil. They'd be battling massive Russian armored columns against great odds. They were badly beaten by their much bigger neighbor. Now, over a month later, their army is in ruins, one of America's closest friends, occupied by Russia. And U.S.-Russian relations stand at a precipice. The question many are asking, how did we get here? The Russian invasion of Georgia took many by surprise, but the warning signs were there all along. Georgia sits at a key strategic location at the crossroads of Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Russia is directly to the north. Iran is only 100 miles away. This makes Georgia an attractive partner to the United States. But according to Georgian President Mikhail Saakashvili, who was educated in the U.S., the relationship is rooted in shared values.
We are not pro-American, we are building America here. That's to say, we are building society based on freedom, free enterprise, individual freedoms of people, and basically the kind of relationship that exists between the government and the overall the society, as I've learned in the United States back in the 90s.
Georgia may not quite feel like America, but here in the bustling capital, Tbilisi, a young educated population and a booming economy mix comfortably with a deeply Christian society that goes back centuries. And unlike so many countries these days, Georgia seems to truly like America and Americans. This is, after all, a rare corner of the world where visitors are greeted by a George W. Bush Street on their way in from the airport.
People have a genuine affection for the United States. I would also say that people have a genuine affection for George Bush because his visit here in the spring of 2005 was such a kind of a political earthquake. It showed Georgia that America cared about Georgia and that we saw this part of the world, not just in terms of Russia, but that we recognized the independence and we supported the development of this particular country.
U.S. Ambassador to Georgia John Teft says that Georgia is the kind of ally America wants and needs.
The United States believes Georgia is a country that that's very important for a number of respects. First is this is a country that's building democracy, market economy, and rule of law society of the kind that we strongly support throughout the world. We support and spend money here to help develop the democracy. We think Georgia can be an example for this part of the world.
I think the U.S. has all the interest in having Georgia successful, because Georgia's success will be closely watched by all of our neighbors. It is closely watched, monitored, and they'll make their own conclusions. If we're successful, they're going to take this route. If we fail, then certainly it will scare people away from democracy and freedom for many decades to come.
Like much of the former Soviet Union, Georgia had a messy transition to independence. After the final collapse of the Soviets in 1991, Georgia for years was mired in chaos, until 2004, when a young Mikhail Saakashvili was brought to power after the so-called Rose Revolution, massive nonviolent protests that demanded more democracy and an end to the rampant corruption. And while Saakashvili's record on democratic reforms is mixed, just last November he himself violently suppressed political protests The U.S. and the West are inclined to overlook these shortcomings. Why? Perhaps it's the oil. Georgia offers the only feasible transit for Caspian Sea oil that bypasses Russia and Iran.
This is an important strategic area for the resources, particularly hydrocarbons getting from the Caspian out to the Black Sea or down to the Mediterranean through the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline. In a time when resources, energy resources are so expensive and valuable, having all of the available opportunities for energy is critical.
And so with the stakes so high, the U.S. has gone so far as to support one of Georgia's greatest aspirations, to join NATO. All of this, however, doesn't sit very well with the real power in the region, Russia. With an economy and a government budget awash in oil money, and an aggressive and combative Vladimir Putin at the helm, a new member of NATO on its southern border is not something Russia is willing to accept.
What Putin demanded from Saakashvili was political moderation. He wanted Georgia to give up its wish to join NATO. He wanted Georgia to maintain the current balance of power.
Sergei Baburin is a prominent Russian nationalist politician and a former Speaker of Parliament.
When someone from far away wants to exert its own influence in this region and says, let's take Georgia into NATO, well, I think Russia cannot remain unconcerned, especially as we saw NATO military behavior in 1999 in Yugoslavia, where without UN authorization, NATO bombed that sovereign state. So what would make any other country insured against this kind of risk?
Nationalists in Russia see Georgia as some kind of part of some conspiracy, encroachment of Russia by the U.S. interests as well as by the overall Western alliances. And, you know, in some way it's very hard to talk to these people because they don't believe that we genuinely are like we are, that it's our free choice. You know, we are not a big people, but we can make our own informed choices, how to go, with whom to be friends, what kind of political system to build. But all of this is seen in wider picture of encircling Russia, encroaching on them.
To see what he means, take a look at the map. The U.S. is putting missile defense systems in Poland. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Bulgaria, all are new NATO members. The Ukraine, a friend to the U.S. To the east, Kyrgyzstan, now home to a substantial American airbase. And then this spring, a final straw. The U.S. recognized the independence of Kosovo, a move that Russia objected to bitterly.
In April, Russia took some steps that were dramatic in terms of an apparent shift away from Russia's own policy of supporting the territorial integrity of Georgia.
U.S. State Department official Matthew Bryza says Putin decided to retaliate by creating big trouble for Georgia inside Georgia.
He decided to turn up the heat. And so in April, on the 16th of April, the Russian Kremlin issued a series of directives, or a directive calling for a series of actions to strengthen Moscow's ties with Georgia's separatist regions.
So Russia ramped up its support of Georgia's own two internal hotspots, South Ossetia and Abkhazia. These two regions in Georgia's west and north have existed in a sort of limbo since the early 1990s, when they tried to break away from Georgia, but failed to establish full independence. Now, these separatist regions found themselves getting increased economic and even political support from Moscow. And Russia made it clear it would no longer tolerate Georgia's claims to these breakaway regions.
Even though some Georgians have criticized Russians for their imperialist mentality, it is in fact Georgia that became imperialist. I am ready to tell any Georgian politician, you are imperialist if you want Abkhazia and South Ossetia to live under you. Forget about criticizing us for ambitions to be a big nation. You are a big nation trying to annihilate others.
This summer, the United States tried desperately to defuse the tensions diplomatically. We met up with State Department negotiator Matthew Bryza just hours after his meetings in late July with breakaway leaders in Abkhazia and a deeply concerned President Saakashvili.
Around Tbilisi, there's a belief that Russia is engaged in a policy of creeping annexation of Abkhazia. And because Georgians feel so strongly that Abkhazia must be part of Georgia, those sorts of actions lead to an escalation of tension. In fact, they provoke an escalation of tension that, unless channeled in a more positive direction, could lead to armed conflict.
A powder keg in these faraway lands, Russia reasserting its regional dominance over Georgia, a neighbor that had become a close American ally. And at the center, the separatist territories of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. In the Georgian capital, Tbilisi, there is a memorial to the lives lost during Georgia's wars with its separatist territories in the 1990s. The wars began when those territories, South Ossetia and Abkhazia, wanted independence from Georgia, but Georgia refused to let them go. The wounds have never healed, and now these breakaway regions are at the center of a new conflict, which includes Russia and the United States. To understand why, we set off for Abkhazia, the bigger of the two breakaway provinces. We were granted rare access here just days before the war between Georgia and Russia broke out. We were entering a country that does not officially exist. Permission first had to come from the Abkhaz, who were in de facto control. In our first few hours in Abkhazia, we were granted an interview with the so-called president of the breakaway province, Sergei Bagapsh.
Я также откровенно хочу вам сказать,
I want to be honest in telling you that Abkhazia will never again in its history become part of Georgia, because it never was part of Georgia. We are ready to live next to one another, to build normal relations as two independent governments, but we will never be part of Georgia again.
Bagapsh says that Abkhazia has a historical claim to independence.
вы знаете, наверное, Сталин...
In the Soviet times, as you probably already know, during the time of Stalin and the Soviet Union, our republic was transferred to become part of Georgia. And during that Soviet period, for some 50 years, we continued to fight for our independence.
Caught up in the spirit of freedom when the Soviet Union dissolved in the early 1990s, Abkhazia and South Ossetia decided to push for their own independence. But Georgia was not willing to allow these two territories to break away and responded militarily, and the wars were bloody and brutal. Even though the Balkans and Rwanda are considered the hallmarks of mass atrocity of the 1990s, the war in Abkhazia came first, with neighbor turning on neighbor. Thousands were killed on both sides, and more than 200,000 ethnic Georgians were driven from Abkhazia in what has been called an act of ethnic cleansing. For their part, the Abkhaz say the war was a deliberate attempt to erase them from history.
It was an ordinary day like this, when Georgian army just entered the city and started shooting. Just behind us, it was an Abkhaz archive on this lawn, and it was completely burnt. All documents about Abkhaz history were just destroyed.
Maxim Gungia works in the foreign ministry of the Abkhaz government.
What are your memories of those days?
Very bad memories. It's a very strange situation when you start to understand human reality, human identity. And humans are could be very cruel, very rough. It's very strange to see how people change in a second.
And there was a lot of violence against ethnic Georgians, too.
You're right. This is war. It was a lot of crimes, I would say. When the fighting starts, you already can hardly say who is right, who is wrong. It is very, very sad situation.
Here in Abkhazia's capital, Sukhumi, reminders of what happened are hard to miss. On every block, on every corner, empty shells stand where beautiful villas once hosted generals and leaders. Sukhumi was once the chosen getaway of the Soviet elite. Joseph Stalin even built a vacation home here. There are still hints of the thriving resort town it once was, but it is now mostly faded. The clock tower may still work, but it feels as if time here has stopped. And though the war may have been more than 15 years ago, billboards all over town remind citizens of the heavy price they paid. No family here escaped untouched.
Our family was a very happy, hard-working family. There were 5 sons, my husband and me. My oldest son was a university student, the second one was in high school, and the third was at the Agricultural Institute. We were just a hard-working family, full of joy.
Tamara Ezugbaya has spent all her life in a small Abkhaz village. When the war came in 1993, 4 out of her 5 sons were called up to duty to fight the Georgians. And within months of each other, all 4 had died in combat.
Do you think about your sons a lot?
Of course. This house was actually built together with my sons. They poured the concrete. Every block, every corner was made by them. Days pass by and I get older and older and everything becomes harder. It's not like they say that time heals wounds. There is no way these wounds will heal.
Despite her pain, Tamara hopes the cause her sons died for, Abkhazia's independence, will one day be realized.
We are a nation in mourning. Black is the color of mourning, and so we wear black clothes. And I really hope that we will soon take off the black clothes because Abkhazia will be recognized and we will become an independent country.
In your opinion, is there any other political solution besides full independence? Is it possible for Abkhazia to remain an autonomous region within Georgia?
They say that the border between Georgia and Abkhazia is closed, and I hope that it will be closed forever.
Abkhazia's refusal to be part of Georgia has made them an outcast, their nation unrecognized by the rest of the world. But to them, there is no choice.
We don't want to risk anymore. And if there is a choice between living for generations in an unrecognized country or to be part of Georgia, we all would rather choose to be unrecognized for many other years instead of putting life of our families and children into risk. I understand that international community see Georgia as example of democracy, but for Abkhazia, Georgia is still enemy. We still remember the past. We still remember that hatred. We don't want to risk anymore. We don't want any experiments.
And to the Abkhaz, this also means not allowing the return of all those ethnic Georgians that were purged in the war of the 1990s. Over 200,000 of them still live as refugees 15 years after the war. They remain in squalid conditions. Many of them can even see their former homes just across the border in Abkhazia.
My husband was badly beaten during the war. The Abkhazians captured him and beat him. He's been afraid to go back there ever since.
We met a group of Georgians living in the remains of a former Soviet factory building.
Tell me about the conditions in this place that you live. Is this a reasonable way to live?
We have nothing here. We do not even have water. The water is not good and many people got sick. It is very hard here.
This is the Georgian version of a refugee camp. With no electricity, the hallways of the dilapidated factory are dark and dreary. The small rooms are austere, hot in the summer, cold in the winter. Raw sewage bubbles up from the ground behind a reeking line of outhouses. Residents here, all 300 of them, share one small building for washing. Still, the settlement offers them safety compared to where they came from.
What has to happen politically for you and everybody else here to be able to go back to your homes?
We want peace. Let it be peace, and we do not want anything else. We do not have homes now, but we will still go back and try to do something. I am an old woman myself, but my children will do something, and we will make a life for ourselves. Why did we have to let things come between us? We always got along fine. Let there be peace and our return. It has been 15 years already that we have been told we will go back either today or tomorrow.
With life here as difficult as it is, some aren't willing to wait for a peaceful settlement. Already almost 50,000 have returned to Abkhazia, despite the dangers of living under Abkhaz rule. The border is officially closed, but that doesn't stop many Georgians from crossing a makeshift footbridge over the river that forms the border, under the watchful eyes of Abkhaz militia. But many find life back in Abkhazia isn't much easier than the ones they left behind in the refugee settlements.
I wanted to ask you, you're wearing all black. What happened? Did someone in your family die?
My brother passed away.
She is unable to tell you the whole story. He was from my village. He lived on the other side. He had children, and they lived in financial distress. His nerves shut down. He could not bear it anymore, and he killed himself. Life is tough here and there. Anyone who can't take it here anymore leaves to go there. Life is hard there, and they live under constant danger. Sometimes tragic things like this happen.
Back in Tbilisi, Georgian President Mikhail Saakashvili makes the case that this is a human rights issue.
Now, if you throw out almost 500,000 people out of their houses based on their ethnic origin, you expel the population, and then this is one thing, of course, people can leave because of trouble and war, but then when they don't let them back based on their ethnic origin, when you distinguish based on ethnicity, I think this is ludicrous, this is barbaric. We are living in 21st century. I can never accept this.
But no long-term arrangements have ever been made by the Georgian government for the refugees. And critics say Saakashvili uses the refugee issue for political and diplomatic gain. In any case, the return of the refugees continues to be a major hurdle to peace. On the Abkhaz side, there is too much bitterness to allow all the Georgians back in.
There is a significant population living just across the ceasefire border that are Georgian ethnicity who used to live in Abkhazia and feel too insecure to return. This must be asked because it seems to be a precondition of any negotiated peace.
I agree. That's
How can this situation be solved?
It's a very hard issue, the refugees issue. I know that's, I feel very sorry about many innocent people who were victims of the war and who had to flee, and now they live somewhere in the middle. And I understand we have to resolve the issue, but the return of all Georgian refugees is impossible because many of these people were involved in conflicts. If they return, it will ignite another war.
I can't see a peaceful coexistence while the contradictions that have led to the war are not resolved.
Liana Kvarchelia is an Abkhaz activist who works on reconciliation with the Georgians.
On the 30th of September, we're going to celebrate a victory day. And for Georgians, it's a day of the loss of Abkhazia. They are grieving on this day. We are celebrating on this day. We have very different pictures of what happened and very different ideas about how this conflict has to be resolved.
It reminds me sometimes of the situation in the Middle East. My first post in the Foreign Service was in Jerusalem. And when you have a war, when both sides suffer, it's perfectly understandable that the families of those who have died or been severely wounded are very angry and very upset. And there are those on both sides here. There are also tens of thousands of Georgians who were driven out of from their homes. And they have a very strong feeling, as you could imagine, about this. Ultimately, a political solution has to be found.
But politically, the world sided with Georgia, insisting on the return of these refugees and isolating Abkhazia diplomatically and economically. And Abkhazia struggled. But then came a resurgent Russia, looking for a way to flex its muscles in the region. According to Abkhaz President Sergei Bagapsh, Russia became the only lifeline for his unrecognized territory.
Russia helped us with humanitarian aid. When our children were dying, every bit of help we were getting was coming from the Russian Federation. That is why we have had good friendly relations and will continue to have them. Today, Russia is our partner, and we are working on a lot of projects together. These days in Abkhazia, Russia accounts for 99% of our business. That is why it is natural that we are discussing certain economic and political issues. No one listens to the Abkhazia side. We are not allowed to speak in the United Nations. They listen only to Georgia. So it is only natural that sometimes we ask Russia to make our voice heard.
Right after our interview, President Bagapsh rushed off to Moscow for meetings with Russian officials. And connections with Russia are not limited to the government. 80% of Abkhazia's estimated 200,000 residents now hold Russian citizenship and Russian passports. It's the only way they can travel to the outside world. And many elderly here receive monthly pensions from Moscow. Russia is Abkhazia's only official trading partner.
The only open window or open door, if you like, was Russia.
Liana Kvarchelia met us outside the hulking remains of the former Soviet administration building, destroyed during the First War and left in ruins as a reminder.
Georgia wanted to isolate us from the rest of the world, including Russia. But the result was that we were isolated from the rest of the world except Russia. So Russia was the only route for us. So when Georgia is now complaining that we are too dependent on Russia or there is too much Russian influence, I think this is the consequence of the policy of isolation that Georgia initiated.
Would you actually prefer for Abkhazia to have less of a relationship with Russia if it could have more relationships with the rest of the world?
I think what we want is to have balanced relationships with all our neighbors. Russia is a very big neighbor, and Russia can't be ignored. And in future, I think, of course, we will be developing our relations with Russia. But we want to be open to the rest of the world as well.
But for now, Russia is Abkhazia's only ally. And while things are still tough here, life is improving slowly with Russian support. Surprisingly, a lot of the money that comes in is from tourism. Russian families flock to Sukhumy's Black Sea beaches. They don't seem to mind lounging next to the rusty relics of cargo ships, or strolling the streets past bullet-scarred buildings. And the effect of this tourism money is apparent in everyday life. Vegetables, bread, cheese, and other life staples like vodka are easily bought in the market. But you must pay in rubles, as the Russian currency is the only one accepted here. Longtime residents of Sukhumy say their very survival depends on the Russians.
Russia, thanks to Putin, gives us 2,000 rubles as a pension. If not for Putin, this would of course be the end.
And the increased presence of Russia in Abkhazia doesn't end at the civilian level. Russian troops have been allowed to patrol here as part of the ceasefire agreement that ended the 1993 war. But as Russia drew closer to Abkhazia, this military presence took on new dimensions, as Georgia and Russia engaged in an escalating game of brinksmanship that ultimately, some say inevitably, led to the war we saw break out on August 8th. The dangerous game of brinksmanship between Georgia and Russia played out here, in the stunning Caucasus Mountains. This is the Kadori Valley, a small sliver of gorgeous and hotly disputed real estate. The valley is only about 25 miles long, but in recent months it became one of the tensest places on Earth. The Kadori Valley is inside Abkhazia, but in 2006, Georgian troops seized control of this strategic area. We came here with an armed Georgian escort in early August, just 48 hours before the war with Russia broke out. The Georgians had been pouring in resources here, building roads, schools, and health clinics. At least some of the residents seemed happy to be back under Georgian control.
Now that we have a new government, we are more relaxed. During the war, it was only us, the local residents, but now we feel supported.
But the Abkhaz and their Russian backers were deeply worried. They suspected that Georgia might use the Kadori Valley as a jumping-off point for an invasion of the rest of Abkhazia. Russia voiced these concerns at an emergency United Nations Security Council meeting as recently as late July.
The truth of the matter is that in the past few years, to a large extent because of unconstructive moves by the Georgian side, the situation in the areas of the conflict has deteriorated. The first thing, in order to try to restore confidence is to sign an agreement on non-use of force, pull out those forces from the Kadori Valley so that everybody could see that the Georgian side is not attempting to resort to military force to resolve the situation.
Georgian officials, including the ones that brought us to the valley, make no apologies for keeping their troops here. After all, they believe this is their soil.
We don't see any need for their withdrawal. They are doing here their job. They are not danger to anybody, as it has been demonstrated by the 3 years of experience of having them here. And I think we have the legitimate right to ensure the law and order, to protect the border and ensure the security of the valley, which is so highly valued target for the Russians in the Abkhazia.
Along with the war of words, military moves intensified. Russia increased its troop presence in the area, and the Georgian forces found themselves in an intense staring match across the fragile ceasefire line. And then this. In March, a Russian MiG fighter shot down an unmanned Georgian surveillance aircraft. This video, released by the Georgians, was recorded by the surveillance plane's own onboard camera as it was destroyed. Next, in a provocative show of force, Russian jets flew over Georgian airspace, while American Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice was visiting.
We are not talking anymore about frozen conflicts. These conflicts are not frozen anymore. I think that's a quite significant change.
Timur Yakubashvili is Georgia's special minister dealing with the breakaway republics.
And what has thawed these conflicts?
Russians, their behavior, deployment of illegal troops on Georgian soil. It's nothing else but occupation, and aggressive actions by shutting down our planes and bombing and etc. etc. That's aggression. We know that military confrontation with Russian Federation is not a good idea, but we are not going to give up any inch, even 1 inch of our territory. And if we need to fight, we will.
A couple of analysts have suggested to me that at least once in the last 6 months, maybe twice, Georgia has considered military action against Abkhazia.
Well, you can speculate as much about it as you can. It's like Poland attacking Germany in 1939, or because this is not Abkhazia, this is Russia there. It's Russian, these are Russian troops. Anything that will be planned in Abkhazia will have to confront Russian troops there. They are present. And so if you are considering something like in that part of Georgia, you have to consider that it has everything to do with Russia. There is no real local army or local militia. You are dealing with Russian troops. With all the courage I can observe in our troops, nobody would be crazy enough to attack the Russian army, right?
But war did break out. Just hours after our meeting, and despite President Saakashvili's words, Georgia launched an assault on South Ossetia in response to shelling from that breakaway province. Fighting quickly broke out in parts of Abkhazia, too, as Abkhaz forces took advantage of the chaos to quickly seize the Kadori Valley. And as of tonight, Russian troops are still inside Georgia. There wasn't much the U.S. could do to help the Georgians militarily, so words and emergency humanitarian aid had to do.
The people of Georgia have cast their lot with the free world, and we will not cast them aside.
The U.S. has now pledged $1 billion to help rebuild Georgia. Russia says that South Ossetia and Abkhazia will never return to Georgian hands. Georgia, backed by the United States, says these territories are theirs. It is a dispute that shows no signs of ending.
Some have wondered if the U.S., through its support of Georgia, is being brought into more direct confrontation with Russia over your internal issue.
Well, I think this is not about our internal issues, or that's not about the U.S.-Russia confrontation in general. This is about values. I was brought up to believe in since my childhood. I was taught in the American universities, and these values are the following: that rule of law should be upheld worldwide. People who fight for freedom should be supported by other freedom-loving nations, and that there should not be a compromise on principles. If you compromise on principles in one place, it's going to backfire in other places. That's what it's all about. And it's about American prestige, at least in this part of the world.